Well, as you can imagine from the title, when Reformation is futile, we are going to get what feels like a breath of fresh air with the reign of Josiah, but it will not prove to be something that will change what is ultimately the wrath and judgment of Yahweh toward Judah. So we're anchoring in this quote from John Stott: history is not a random series of meaningless events. It is rather a succession of periods and happenings which are under the sovereign rule of God, who is the God of history. And I think that what we see in these two chapters today is definitely the sovereignty of God in the life of the people that he's chosen to make his. 2 Kings, or the book of both kings together in a glance. This is put together by Tim Keller, and I used it in one of my previous teachings, but I like to keep in mind that we start out with the ideal king. We have a decline that's very evident. We have the word of the Lord coming through Elijah and Elisha, and then we have further decline that leads to Babylonian exile, which we're going to head to at a pretty rapid pace in 24 and 25 next week. This, again, feels like a little bit of a reprieve because of what we see from Josiah. I want to back up just a little bit to, we come out of last chapter 21, with the evil of Manasseh, and his son Ammon is really no better, and it doesn't set well with the people. And so it says that the servants, in verse 23, the servants of Ammon conspired against him, put the king to death in his house. But the people of the land struck down all those who had conspired against King Ammon, and the people of the land made Josiah, his son, king in his place. And so there's a quote here from Dale Ralph Davis. He says, "I don't know much about the people of the land. That is, I don't know how deep their faith or how earnest their piety was, but it is fascinating that after 55 years of Manasseh and 2 years of Manasseh Jr., he calls him, they do not cast aside the Davidic succession of kings. After over half a century of disenchantment, who could blame them had they said they were finished with David's line of kings, since it gave them only rogues and bums? They hadn't seen any royal attractiveness for decades. And yet, in line with Yahweh's promise, they install an 8-year-old descendant of David as king. And how could they know he wouldn't prove Manasseh III? Or how could they be sure he could bring any ultimate good, since Manasseh had made judgment certain for Judah? But, like dropping anchor to ride out a furious storm, they hold to Yahweh's kingdom promise in spite of the disappointments and wickedness that have closed in on them." So that's a great way to frame where we begin chapter 22. I'm going to give you an overview. So we begin 22. We begin 22 with this description of Josiah's reign. It says, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. And he, talking about Josiah, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the way of David, his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. I kind of feel like we have to read that again. What? He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in all the way of David, his father, and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. So take a look here. This is what we know about Josiah. He joins, we've got 7 kings who we are told, 7 other kings we're told did what was right. We've got Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. So these are the kings. Out of all these kings we've seen, these are the only ones we're told did what was right versus did what was wrong. Only 2 others besides Josiah share a favorable comparison to David, Asa and Hezekiah. And of course, his steadfastness puts him in a category actually with Hezekiah. So again, glimpses of something good here in the midst of so much bad, as the quote said earlier, rogues and bums. And so the challenge here is for us to see Josiah's reign as a kindness from Yahweh, even if we know his judgment is still coming and it's still certain. So in chapter 3 here, it says, in the 18th year of King Josiah, so he would have been 26, the king sent Shaphan, the son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary, to the house of the Lord, saying, go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may count the money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. And let it be given into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And let them give it to the workmen who are at the house of the Lord, repairing the house, that is, to the carpenters and to the builders and to the masons. And let them use it for buying timber and quarried stone to repair the house. But no accounting shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into their hand, for they deal honestly. So we have some sort of repair going on. We've got some work going on in the temple here. And he's instructing, he's commanding and sending. And then we suddenly go to this scene where Hilkiah, this priest, finds the book of the law. Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Then Shaphan the secretary told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it before the king. This is likely a big chunk of Deuteronomy, if not all of Deuteronomy. So we've got this book of law that is from the time and mouth of Moses that's being read to Josiah. And the assumption here is Josiah has no knowledge of this, has not heard this. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. So that's repentance. He's humbling himself. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam the son of Shaphan and Achbor the son of Micaiah and Shaphan the secretary and Asaiah the king's servant, saying, go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. If you remember much about Deuteronomy, you have a lot of instruction, and then you also have a whole lot of, here's what's going to happen if you don't do this, right? For instance, in chapter 27, you have a lot of curses. Cursed be anyone who does not conform to the words of this law by doing them. And you've got multiple times where God is saying, here's what's going to happen if you aren't faithful to this law. So he's hearing all of this, and he's saying, we're in trouble. He's got a word from the law at this point, and now he wants a word from a prophet. He wants to understand, he wants to clarify, he wants to confirm what's going on. He wants to hear from God through a prophet. So in 14 it says, so Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam and Achbor and Shaphan and Asaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum the son of Tikvah, son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. That sounds kind of C.S. Lewis, doesn't it? But it's not. It really just would mean that someone has to be in charge of the robes, the vestments of the priests. Now, she lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter, so there's some space-time history for us there that this happens to be where she lived in Jerusalem. And they talked with her. And she said to them, this prophetess says, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, thus says the Lord, behold, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants, all the words of the book that the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have made offerings to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the work of their hands. Therefore, my wrath will be kindled against this place, and it will not be quenched. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, regarding the words that you have heard, because your heart was penitent, and you humbled yourself before the Lord, when you heard how I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, and your eyes shall not see all the disaster that I will bring upon this place. And they brought back word to the king. So let's make sense of Huldah's prophecy here. She says, number one, there's no hope for Judah. Yahweh is going to bring disaster against them because they have forsaken him. The disaster that you are reading in the book of the law is sure, it's happening. But along with that, because Josiah was humble and his heart was soft and he took this very seriously, there's some mercy for him. He is not going to live to see this disaster. So we have to see that as some mercy toward Josiah. And also this idea that judgment is certain, But with God, it can be delayed, and that's a mercy. Disaster is happening, but not yet, right? And so we might ask ourselves, what if the next king had also been like Josiah? And what if the next king had been like Josiah? And what if the next king had... How long would God have withheld this? And of course, we don't know the answer to that, but it seems like a great problem to have for a God who we know delights in mercy. To me, it seems like that would have been a great problem. But we don't see that, unfortunately. So they bring this word back to the king, and his response is really what we see in chapter 23. And I've got a little outline here, and this is chronologically how it is described in chapter 23. I want to point out, if you read this in 2 Chronicles 34 and 35, it's going to be different. And I don't think that has to be a problem, but I do want to point it out in case you run across that you understand the reforming worship. We're clearly led to believe in 2 Chronicles 34 that he was already in the process of reforming that worship. It was underway. That's why they were in the temple cleaning things out when they found the book. That's because they had already begun to do things. And so here we see this description of what he does to reform worship, and it looks as if it's happening after the renewing of the covenant, but it's pretty clear just even from 22 that they're already in that process, and now the writer's going back and telling us about it, and there's nothing really wrong with that. But we get to see his response. It says in 23, verse 1, then the king sent, again, we see king command, king sent. We see the king sent, and all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem were gathered to him. And the king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets, all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. Again, bear in mind, he's just heard from the prophetess, it's too late. This is not going to stop God's wrath. And still he says, no, we're renewing the covenant, and leads the people to do the same. Verse 4, it says, and the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order, and the keepers of the threshold, to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. So this is what's probably already been happening. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. And he deposed the priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places at the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem. Those also who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon and the constellations and all the hosts of the heavens. And he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and beat it to dust, and cast the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. And he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes who were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. And he brought all the priests out of the cities of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had made offerings, from Jeba to Beersheba. And he brought down the high places of the gates that were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on one's left at the gate of the city. And pay attention, when he's defiling these places, what he's trying to do is ensure that they can't be used again for worship, for wrong worship. He's not just removing the articles, removing the landmarks, etc. He's trying to make sure that these places won't ever be usable for pagan worship again. However, the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brothers. And he, back to Josiah, defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. And he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the chamberlain which was in the precincts. He burned the chariots of the sun with fire, and the altars on the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars that Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He pulled down and broke in pieces and cast the dust of them into the brook Kidron. And the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, to the south of the mount of corruption, which Solomon, the king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, and the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And he broke in pieces the pillars and cut down the Asherim and filled their places with the bones of men. So you can see he's really trying to destroy what has been established up to this point. He's not taking half measures here. And so we see he continues that through verse 15. It continues to name altars and high places and who erected them. We get to sort of a little history of all the bad kings that we get to see as we go through this. And again, he burns them. I thought this was interesting. So it says in 17, he runs across something. He says, what is that monument that I see? So he sees something and he thinks, okay, is this something we need to destroy? And the men of the city told him, it is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and predicted these things that you have done against the altar at Bethel. And he said, let him be. Let no man move his bones. So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came out of Samaria. I don't know who that is. I think it is safe for us to assume that it is one of the two main prophets there. So he leaves that alone because that's okay to have a monument there. But then he continues to remove shrines from the high places and places where pagan worship and sacrifice were done. So then we get to verse 21. He comes back to Jerusalem. By the way, one of the reasons that this was probably already going on before he found the book of the law, before the book of the law was found in the temple, is that this could not have all happened in his 18th year. So this is probably, when you think about it, this is probably happening in the years leading up to his 18th year. And then we get to his 18th year, and that's when the book is found. Because if you looked at the map and you looked at how far he would have had to go to make sure all this stuff was done, it would have taken a long time to settle this right. So he's probably doing all that in his early to mid-20s. And then by the time he's 26, then we have this moment where the book is found. And that's when the covenant is renewed. And then what we also see in verse 21 is that he restores the Passover. It says, and the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. For no such Passover has been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or of the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah put away the mediums and the necromancers and the household gods and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law that were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. And then the writer gives him some extra kudos here. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Nor did any like him arise after him. Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there. So consider that from verse 1 of 23, we see all that Josiah is doing. We see all the reform. We see all of the undoing of the wickedness, undoing of the evil, undoing of the paganness, all the things that displease God. And we get 25 verses of that, including the Passover. And then we hit verse 26 and it says, still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath. I think the writer is building us up through all of this so that we will hit verse 26 and understand that God's judgment and God's wrath are still certain for Judah in a really stark and contrasted way, because we see all this stuff and you get to that point and you think, surely this is more than anybody's done. Surely this is enough. And then in 26 you see, no, God is still has judgment waiting for Judah. And so then we get to see what we were told in 22 would be this gathering of Josiah to his grave in peace, which to me doesn't feel very peaceful. But Josiah's death in battle here, verse 28, says, now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him. This is probably completely unnecessary. Honestly, I don't know that there was anything really going on here that required Josiah to go into battle with him. Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. So this king who does all that we've read, it ends like that in battle. His servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the king of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's place. And this sets the stage for prepare to yawn. It's back to the same old stuff. The stale and uninteresting and really uncompelling story of the evil kings. We pick back up in verse 31. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah in the land of Hamath, and he might not reign in Jerusalem, and laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, so this is the tribute that he's demanding. But he taxed the land to give the money according to the command of Pharaoh. But we see, if we read about him in Jeremiah, what we see is that he also has this pretty incredible palace for himself. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give it to Pharaoh Necho. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebidah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. So we're back to more wicked kings, which unfortunately is the norm for Judah, despite the fact that we have this really refreshing period with Josiah that seems like it could be hopeful in some way, seems like it could course correct in some way, but it does not. And so that's where we end, and we're going right into 24 and 25, which to me feels like the writer is picking up speed and wants to be done with this. It feels to me like we just covered 4 kings in just a few verses. Okay, yeah, back to the bad kings. Let's get through this. We all know what's coming. That's what it feels like to me. And so unfortunately, we end on this note that is not as refreshing as the rest of the 2 chapters are, because we all know where we're going with this. And so next week we'll pick up with the Jehoiakim and see what becomes of Judah, even though we know where that's going.